Hello, grandson. This is your grandfather, and I've got another story about our family. Now, this story is about a 5-year-old Indian fighter. It all starts with her grandfather, Gilbert. Gilbert was in America, in New York Colony, back right before the American Revolution. And when the American Revolution broke out, he decided he was going to be loyal to the king. Now, a lot of your ancestors fought for America to become an independent nation, and they rebelled against the King of England, but not Gilbert. He wanted to be loyal to the King of England, so they kicked him out of America and banished him to Nova Scotia, where Canada, what we call Canada today, Nova Scotia, and he had to live there. He was banished on the very day that his daughter Sally was born. And after the Americans won the American Revolution and were a free country, they allowed Gilbert and daughter Sally and the whole family to come back to America, and they settled in New York Colony. Not colony, state. It was now a part of the United States of America. And he settled there, and Sally grew up, and she met a French patriot, Robert Jaycox, who had been one of the French people who helped make America free and fight against the King of England. And Sally and Robert, they got married, and unfortunately, Robert died while chopping down a tree to build a fence for his farm. And it was a very sad accident. And he died, and he left Sally alone with 3 children, a son and 2 daughters, Lydia and Lavinia. And one night in 1829, that was a long time ago, they were at home alone. Now, except for the son had gone out hunting because they had to find some meat to put on the table and to cook. And that's what they did back then. Didn't have grocery stores, but they would have to grow their own food and hunt their own fish and hunt bear and possum and things like that to eat. Well, Sally and the 2 girls, Lavinia and Lydia, they were alone at the house. And then this man came riding up on a horse, a neighbor, and she knew who it was. And this neighbor pleaded with Sally, "Come to my house. My wife is sick. She is as sick as a dog. You got to come and help her. You got to nurse her back to health." And everybody in the community knew that Sally was good at nursing sick people back to health. Now, this was way out in the frontier of New York State, and it wasn't very populated back then, and so it was about 10 miles to the nearest neighbor. So she got on a horse and she rode with the neighbor, and she left the 2 kids. 5-year-old Lydia, who is your great, 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 great grandmother, when she was 5 years old, and Lavinia, who was all of 7 years old, left them alone in that house. But there was nobody around. They were safe and sound. And Sally told her daughter Lydia, "Now you bar the door." Now that meant not only locking the door, but putting a bar of wood into the door so nobody could break in to a door like that. And then late at night, they heard a group of men outside the house. And these men started pounding on the door. "Let us in, let us in." And they were terrified. But they were adults, and they were demanding to be allowed into their house. They didn't know what to do. What would you have done? Well, I tell you what Lydia and Lavinia did. They opened the door, and these Native Americans, Indians, came into the house, sat at the table, and demanded that Lavinia and Lydia cook them supper. And there were a lot of them, and they ate a lot. They were hungry. And so 5-year-old Lydia and 7-year-old Lavinia had to cook for all of these men who were on a hunting trip and not having much luck and were in canoes traveling down the river, and they'd stopped at the Jaycox home. And so Lavinia and Lydia, they prepared a big meal for these folks, and they were terrified. They didn't know who these folks were, and they didn't know what these Native Americans would do. But after they fed them, they stayed up all night, huddled in a corner, shaking and trembling, terrified. And then, as the sun began to rise, the Native Americans, they got up and left. They got in their canoe and sailed away. And I got to tell you, as long as Lydia lived, and she lived to be 80 years old, she died in 1906. As long as she lived, she never, ever opened the door to strangers ever again. Lydia grew up to be a teacher, and she married, and she had a little girl named Sylvia, and Sylvia had a little girl named Betty. Betty was my Grandma Betty, and Grandma Betty had a son, and his name was Bill, and that was my Daddy Bill. Daddy Bill had a son, and that was me. And I had a son, and that was John, and that's your daddy. And your daddy had a son, and his name was Ryan. And that's you. And that's the story of your great, 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 great grandmother Lydia, and how she held off a bunch of Native Americans when she and her sister were all alone.